Hi everyone, I'd like to welcome you to another video on my channel. In this video, we'll be looking at leveraging the Mitre attack framework to further analyze vulnerabilities in your organization. Our learning objective is going to be we'll be looking at what is the Mitre attack framework, what exactly does the Mitre attack framework, what does it mean, how does it help organizations to identify, to detect, and to mitigate, remediate, or monitor cyber attacks or cyber threats in their environment. Another thing also is I'll be looking at how you can actually map a vulnerability to a Mitre attack framework. So what I'll be speaking to is how can you really look at the impact of a vulnerability as compared to the Mitre attack framework. And then lastly, we'll be looking at the demo of how we could map a vulnerability to a Mitre attack framework. All right, so let's dive in. Okay, so what is the Mitre attack framework? So the image you have on my left here provides you with the website image of the Mitre attack framework, and then this is I've provided the link here to you can actually go on yourself to check the Mitre attack framework. We're going to do that more in the lab section. Okay, so the Mitre attack framework, it's a framework that provides a common body of knowledge to the cybersecurity space as to identifying adversarial techniques and tactics and how they go about exploiting vulnerabilities or launching attack against different industries. So the Mitre attack framework just provides you with that body of knowledge, provide you with that real life scenarios of examples or techniques that different adversarial groups have been able to use to exploit different organizations, and now you can actually identify some of the techniques and tactics. Okay, so the word attack actually means the the T, and the CK. They have it's an acronym that has with different meanings. So the A there stands for adversarial. The T stands for tactics. The other T stands for techniques. The C stands for common. And the K stands for knowledge. Okay, so like I said, it provides that detailed information of how adversarials go about, what tactics and techniques they use to launch attacks to different organizations. And if you look on my left here, you see that we have three different categories of organizations, or the organization types that they've actually categorized in terms of understanding the techniques and tactics that is being used by adversarial groups to exploit those different industries. So the first one is the enterprise industry, the second one is the mobile industry, and the third one is the ICS industry, which is industrial control system. So that's the IoT section and all of that. So in all of this, one of the key things I want us to look at is the features, because these features, once you understand these features, it makes it easier for you to be able to understand some of the information that's been provided on the website. Okay, so the first thing is the tactics. So the tactics speaks to what is to be achieved. Okay, so the attacker or the adversarial group have specific things they want to achieve. So these are some of the tactics that that the attackers tend to use in the enterprise environment. So first one is the reconnaissance, for example. That's a tactic. That is what is to be achieved. So the attacker is trying to gather information they can use to plan a future operation. So that's what the tactic is. So all of these tactics, these are some of the things that the attacker is trying to achieve as regards gaining access to or exploiting a particular organization. And then the next thing is the techniques. So the techniques speaks to how to achieve the tactics. Okay, so for example, the reconnaissance, which we said is has to do with an attacker trying to gain information by which they can plan future operations. So there are different techniques they can use. One of the technique is active scanning, so meaning that they can run scans against your devices or against your public information to gather much more information. So that is an example of a technique. And then, so another advantage um, that they provide, that Mitre attack tend to offer, is the mitigation. So after you've looked through some of these techniques, some of these tactics, some of the detections, how you can actually detect, because it provides you with how you can actually detect some of those techniques and tactics that the attackers are trying to use. Then they provide you with mitigation and how you can actually mitigate some of those techniques or tactics that the attacker is trying to use to exploit your environment. And then another thing is the adversarial group. So there are different adversarial groups with different tactics and different techniques. So one of them is the APT1, which we're still going to look into as we proceed in this video. So the APT1 is a Chinese threat group. They're actually involved in a lot of cybersecurity breaches and all of that globally. So this website provides you with the Mitre attack frame, provides you with that huge amount of information whereby you can drill deeper and then use it more. So it's used basically for reporting or for analytical purpose. So you want to provide reporting, to put a little bit of context to probably a vulnerability or a particular attack that probably might be going on, or you want to understand where a particular attacker is in their kill chain, for example. Okay, so this just provides you with that huge amount of information that you can actually begin to look at. And most threat intelligence tools like the Cisco Talos and all of that, they tend to leverage on the Mitre attack framework because they use this information to also provide, based on the threat that's been identified, they tend to provide that huge amount of information using this particular framework. So they tell you, oh, we identified this particular adversarial group. This is the technique that they're using. This is the command that is being launched. This is where they are at the moment. Because they're trying to pivot into another machine in your hand, in your devices, and all of that. So this framework, it's a very important framework that a vulnerability engineer you should understand. Even though it speaks more to threat intelligence, but the knowledge you would gain understanding or using this framework would be of huge value. Okay, so let's proceed. So the next thing to look at is that how do we now map vulnerabilities to this Mitre attack framework? How do we leverage vulnerabilities that we've identified in our environment and see if there's already an existing technique or tactic that particular that a threat's adversarial group could actually take advantage of. So one of the things I've done here is that you might not necessarily have you might not be able to map all the vulnerabilities in your environment to a Mitre attack framework because you might not be able to find it one-on-one in terms of the tactics or the technique. But the concept of this is just to provide that context to say, okay, so if there's a remote code execution, for example, we have a vulnerability of remote code execution, for example, what impact would it have, or what technique can an attacker use to exploit that particular vulnerability? And if we don't have a primary, more like a primary impact, what secondary impact would it have? So in terms of technique, this could be a major technique, or this might be a sub technique. So depending on where that particular vulnerability might latch onto the Mitre attack framework. But the idea behind it is just to provide the context and to show how serious, if a particular vulnerability is being exploited, and what impact will it have on your organization. So I'm going to take you through how you can identify this vulnerability, definitely, which is going to be through your scanning, which you scan your devices, and then you identify some vulnerabilities. Probably those vulnerabilities are exploitable. And then you can now look at the Mitre attack framework and say, okay, so this vulnerability, ABC vulnerability that we have, what kind of impact would it have? Because what this will also do is that it helps you to put a story behind how valuable the critical impact that particular vulnerability will have if it is exploited by any adversarial attack groups out there and all that. So let's dive into the demo section. Okay, so now we're in the demo section and I've already navigated to the site. So there we are. Okay, so if you look at this matrix, so it provides you on this page. You see, it provides you with the matrix, which is a matrix for enterprise, for example. So it tells you that these are the tactics in the enterprise environment, and also these are the techniques. So, like I said, the tactics has to do with what the threat actor is trying to achieve, or the goal, or what we call the why the attacker is doing what they're doing. Okay, so everything you have underneath here, they're called techniques. So it says for you to achieve the reconnaissance goal, there are 10 techniques the threat adversarial could actually use to achieve that goal. Okay, so if you notice here, you see that each of these goals or these techniques has three different numbers. So like active scan is there's three gather victim host information for. So all of this number means that there's a sub technique. So meaning that the active technique is the major technique, and there are other sub techniques that an adversary could actually use to also achieve active scanning, so to speak, for example. Okay, so looking at this, you can also change the layout. You can show the sub techniques. So you see here, these are the sub techniques you have under the active scanning. So you have scanning IP blocks, you have vulnerability scanning, you have bodily scanning, and all of that. So this cuts across all of the tactics as it concerns the enterprise environment. So you can also hide it here as well. You can play around with that in your spare time. Okay, so let's look at the tactics again. So we could look at the enterprise environment. So each of these organization types have different type of tactics that actually applies to them. Okay, so if you look at it here, so for the enterprise, for example, these are all of the tactics that threat adversarial groups could actually use to exploit organizations. There's a reconnaissance, there's resource development, and all of that. The same thing applies to the mobile environment. So you see there's initial access and all of the mobile tactics that could be used to gain access to or exploit a particular organization. And also in the ICS organization types, these are all of the tactics that could be used. Okay, so let's dive into the techniques. So let's look at the enterprise. So the goal here is that I'm not going to take you through, I'm not going to go through all of this because this is a huge amount of information. We can't literally cover them in this video. But I'm just trying to whet your appetite. Then in your spare time, you can go through looking at knowledge I've provided for you in this video. You can use that to drill deeper, gain more knowledge, and all of that. Okay, so let's look at the enterprise. So these are all of the enterprise techniques. These are all of the techniques across. So one of the ways to actually break it down to make it much more easier is to look at it from this angle. So this makes it more easier. So if you click on reconnaissance, for example, so it provides you with detailed information of what reconnaissance is. So it tells you reconnaissance consists of techniques that involve adversarial actively or passively gathering information that could be used to support targeting and all of that. So most of the time, this is always the first stage that the adversarial group is trying to. This is one of the first tactics they use in terms of gathering information about their target and all of that. So it also provides you with that particular detail in terms of techniques. So these are the techniques. So this is a technique, and these numbers here, they are sub techniques. Okay. So if you look at the way, if you go back to the matrix, you see you have show sub techniques. Okay, so you see this is the active scanning, which is the technique, and these are the sub techniques. Okay, so let's go back to enterprise. So it's more easier to navigate from here. Okay, so if you look at the active scanning, for example, it provides you with, so let's click on active scanning. So this is active scanning, for example. So it tells you that adversaries may execute reconnaissance scans to gather information. So here they can be running a passive scan, or they might be running an active scan. So passive scan in the sense that probably they're going through your website, they're doing a WHOIS on your website to gather more information, because some of this information could also be used for social engineering. Okay, so having known some of those techniques, so this is active scanning. So you can also look at the sub technique. So it provide you information as a sub technique. So let's say we use vulnerability scanning, for example. It provides you with vulnerability scanning as a method, as one of the sub-techniques that an attacker could use in active scanning. Okay, so it shows you also the procedural examples. These are the adversarial groups that have actually leveraged, and some of the so let's look at this group for example. So this is an adversarial group. APT28 is a threat group that has been attributed to Russian General Staff Main Intelligence Directorate. So this information is really valuable because it provides you with some of the groups that is also associated with that particular group. It provides you with their information. So these are some of the techniques that they use in gaining access. So literally they might not necessarily have to go through all of the tactics, step by step. So they might just jump, instead of going from reconnaissance, they might just go to remote execution and all of that. So the different approaches that they could use. So looking at active, so this particular group, one of the techniques that they apply to, so this is a sub technique which is vulnerability scanning. Okay, so you see these are some of the, so it takes us back to the vulnerability scanning page, and so it gives us some of the procedures, examples and all of that. So you might just take your time to read through all of that. Okay, so the mitigation, you can actually really mitigate against active scanning. You can fine, you might be able to detect it, but you can't stop an attacker from actually scanning. At least the scanning, which is an attempt. Okay, you can't stop them from attempting to scan. Okay, although you might reduce some of the information they'll be able to find, depending on your security controls you have in your organization as regards that. So it also provides you with how do you detect. So one of the ways to also detect is when you begin to see an abnormal packet type or packets in terms of numbers, so you begin to see huge amount of probes, probably when you're doing your packet capturing, or you're using some of your network traffic tools like your net flow tools to identify huge amount. So it provides you with huge amount of traffic. So saying that, oh, you're seeing huge amount of numbers traffic coming from a particular source going to a particular destination. You see the port numbers that they're trying to scan and all that. So if you use Wireshark, for example, you'll be able to see all of those port numbers and all of that. But this just provides you with that huge amount of information. So this is just one of the techniques okay, that you can actually use to gather more information. So it's actually a good place to understand adversarial techniques and things like that. Okay, so having taken you through some of these things, so the next one thing I also want to go through before I move into the lab proper is, so these are softwares that adversarial groups tend to use. These are software that's been identified. So most trend hunting organizations or trend hunting tools can actually put it in their keywords and try to search for some of these softwares, if these softwares are being used, for example. So this is a software that is being used. It's a Linux-based software which is used to schedule tasks. So some attackers can actually leverage that to schedule tasks, to run specific task, maybe remote code execution type of task, to have it like a backdoor, or to gain access to a service and all of that. So they use threat actors threat intelligence, tend to use some of these tools to just use it to search, use it to query their environment to see if there's any host, running some of these tools. So the AT tool is definitely used to schedule tasks, but it could be manipulated. Okay, so you might just have to look at, so it's huge amount of information that you can actually use. So these are also ways of detecting command execution, monitor executed commands and argument that may abuse task scheduled functionality to facilitate initial recurring execution of malicious code and all of that. So we can't just cover all of this, but at least I've taken you through how this actually works. Okay, so let's move into how we can actually map a vulnerability to the Mitre ATT&CK Framework. Okay, so this is my I have a CentOS machine that I've already installed Qualys Cloud Agent. So let me just show you that the Qualys Cloud Agent has been installed. CTL status Qualys cloud agent. So I'm just using Qualys as an example. It doesn't mean that it has to be Qualys. You can use your Tenable. It could be after you've scanned your host machine using Tenable or using Rapid7 and all of this information. So I'm just using Qualys scan agent as an example. So it shows that Qualys cloud agent is actually running on my host machine. So let me dive into my Qualys cloud, and then we can see. So I'm using the Qualys community version, so you can also look through that and download. It gives you 1 year access to vulnerability management, and then you can have access to it for a year. Okay. Okay, so let's move to cloud agents so that we can view where we have my cloud agent installed on my host machine. So you can see, if we could see my host machine. Okay, so I have one agent. So this is my host machine. Okay, so these are some of the information about my host machine. System information. These are the system information. So one thing you can also use Qualys for is you can use it to build your CMDB, which is configuration management database. So it allows you to have that full information about your assets, and then you can add the asset owners to them and all of that. Okay, so it also provides you with the network information. This is my IP address. Okay, this is the IP address, and then the default gateway and all of those information. So it also provides you with information about open ports. So these are the ports that are open on my Linux machine. These are the software that are installed on them. And then so we have some vulnerability. We have just one vulnerability. Okay, so let's dive into, let me just take you through to dashboard where I can view all the vulnerabilities identified. Okay, so we'll move to vulnerabilities. Okay, so we're waiting for that. Okay, so this is the vulnerability we have. So it's a severity level 3 type of vulnerability, and then we can view. So this is the vulnerability that we're looking at. So it's a Linux kernel local privilege escalation vulnerability. This is the vulnerable version. So there's a Linux kernel version that is installed at the moment, so which is Linux 5.5.14 and all of that. So what this vulnerability does is that it allows an attacker to gain local privilege escalation. So meaning that if this vulnerability is exploited, the attacker will gain full access to that particular machine. Okay, so these are some of the other information about that vulnerability. So it says successful exploitation of this vulnerability could allow attacker to perform malicious actions with elevated privileges. Okay, so the recommendation here is to actually update the kernel. So to do that is just to log on into the machine and then upgrade the kernel. But that's not the essence of this particular video. Okay, I want to look at how we could actually map that vulnerability to the Mitre ATT&CK Framework. Okay, so there's already an exploit available. So if we click to exploit DB, we can find an already existing exploit that could actually take advantage of that particular vulnerability. Okay, also core security also provides how you can actually exploit that particular vulnerability, and there's a patch. Okay, so there's a patch. So the patch is not actually, it's not like it's not available, so to speak, from Qualys perspective. So you just have to go into your machine and then apply the patch and upgrade the patch. So associated malware, these are the malware that are actually associated to that particular vulnerability. And then if we do vuln check, we can also get some more information as regards the malware. So this dead bolt actually it's a ransomware type of attack that an attacker can actually use once they exploit that particular vulnerability. Okay, so let's go to Mitre ATT&CK and let's see where the Linux local privilege escalation vulnerability might actually fall within. Okay, so let's go back to tactics. Okay, so in that space, if you look at it, so there are two different areas I feel that particular vulnerability speaks to. So number one, it speaks to privilege escalation. Okay, so privilege escalation consists of a technique that adversaries use to gain higher level permissions on a system or network. So it speaks to that. So we could also look at beginning to see, okay, so where in these techniques does that particular vulnerability or exploitation of that vulnerability could actually come into, okay? So the first thing, abuse elevation control mechanisms. So adversaries may circumvent mechanisms designed to control elevated privilege to gain higher level permission. So this actually look like one of the exploitation or one of the techniques that could be used to leverage on that particular vulnerability. Okay, so one of the detection techniques, mitigation technique, is that execution prevention. System settings can prevent application from running that haven't been downloaded from legitimate repository, which may help mitigate. So for us, one of the things we might be looking at doing is, number one, is looking at some of these sub techniques. So for us, the first technique we're looking at is this T1548. Okay, so I'm going to copy that. First of all, so one thing I did is to create an Excel sheet that you can actually use to track that. So we'll put in the name of the vulnerability. It's a severity level 3 vulnerability. The primary impact and the secondary impact. It's exploitable, yes. Is there a patch? Yes, because we could also just need to do is to upgrade that particular kernel for the machine. Okay, so to look at that, to bring that into documentation, the first thing we need to do is to copy this particular vulnerability, and then we'll put it in an Excel sheet. Okay, so we've done that. Yes. Okay, and so we might have to stretch this a little bit. I think we need to reduce that a little bit. Okay, so for the severity, let's go back to check the severity of that particular vulnerability. Detection mode, severity level 3, which is happen to be I. So we could just include that severity level 3, severity level, we could just put 3. Okay, and then the primary impact. So looking at the first impact, from the description, it says local privilege escalation. So we have to do deeper. So the first thing we look at is, so this is the first ID, which is the T1548. So primary impact T1518, and then let's see if there are any other, because we're looking specifically at privilege escalation. Okay, so let's go to techniques. I think it's more easier for us to navigate it from there. Privilege escalation. Okay, so these are all of the privilege escalations techniques that could be used. Another one we could also look at is exploitation for privilege escalation. Okay, so adversaries may exploit software vulnerabilities in an attempt to elevate privilege escalations. Okay, so these are some of the procedure examples, and then this is the mitigation that we have as regards that: application isolation and sandboxing, execution prevention. So we looked at the previous form of technique that says that we can actually prevent the execution of that particular technique. Another thing to do, mitigation, is to update the software, okay, which is one of the things that we know that we should do. Okay, so what we could do is that, so these are some of the techniques or controls we could actually put in place. So for mitigation IDs, we could actually add this to it. So let's go back to Excel sheets, and then we can bring this up, and then we had another thing to exert. This is mitigation. Okay, so we put the Mitre attack. Okay, so put the mitigation ID here. Okay, so that's good. So the next thing we might also be looking at the secondary impact of that particular vulnerability, of exploiting that particular vulnerability. Okay, so another thing we could that I feel might be of essence again is we could also look at execution as well. Let's look at some of the things that the attacker could take advantage of to gain access into that particular system. So let's look at system service. Let's look at what the system service says. So adversaries may abuse a system service or daemon to execute commands or programs. Adversaries could execute malicious content by interacting with the, or creating services. So looking at that particular vulnerability, because it's a kernel based, so definitely it's a service that could be exploited. So one of the things we could be looking at again is that, so this is another sub-techniques that we could actually apply to it. So service execution, let's look at service execution. Adversaries may abuse the Windows service control command. So this happens to do with Windows. It doesn't speak to Linux based. So let's see launch CTL. This speaks more to the Mac OS. Okay, let's look at user execution, malicious link. Okay, let's look deeper again and see what are the initial processes that also might be used to exploit that particular vulnerability. So you see that it requires a lot of research as to looking deeper and seeing what could be a possible means by which that particular vulnerability could be exploited, looking at all of these techniques. So for the execution, we might not really find anything that looks like could be as an execution to exploit that. Okay, so let me look deeper, see if there's any other thing we could actually touch that could be of value. Okay, so let's look at the Unix shell and see the execution of how that could be done. Unix shell, adversaries may abuse Unix shell command and scripts for execution. Okay, so if we go back to that particular exploit that already exists, so what that means is that this exploit needs to be uploaded into the machine itself. So here what we might be looking at is that machine would also definitely, the command will be injected into the machine, and then that would execute this particular exploits. So if we could look at execution as well, command and scripting interpreters under execution. So this might also be one of the impact that it could cause. So what we might be looking at is how do we ensure that the execution of that script doesn't work. So let's look at PowerShell. This happens more functions, focuses on Windows. Let me see. Unix shell. Okay, so this focuses on Linux and Mac OS. Okay, so this in itself, it's a secondary impact that could happen as a result of that particular vulnerability. So we could put that here. And then, so in terms of mitigation, we might also look at the two mitigations that so the first one we said is to patch that particular, is to upgrade the version of the kernel. So let's look at what could be a mitigation for this. Execution prevention is one of the mitigation we could actually use against that. So let's look at execution prevention. Okay, so blocks execution of code on a system through application control or script blockade. Okay, so we could also use this as well as a means by ensuring that that particular vulnerability could not actually be exploited. So we have one already, which is to patch. Okay, and then the other one is to mitigate. So this is a typical example of how I call this my vulnerability register. So we could actually use that opportunity, sorry, we could actually use that to ensure that we have a story behind managing those particular vulnerabilities and seeing how the impact that it would have on our business. Okay, so having looked at this, I believe that this should be of help to someone. If you find this valuable, can you like and share? And then I'll see you in my next video. Thanks for watching.